Thank you for joining us here as we explore the Old Testament. We're going to take a look today at 1 Samuel chapter 3. Last week, we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 1, and we saw the end of the period of the judges. A woman named Hannah married to a man named Elkanah. Hannah had no children. And even during this period of the judges, this family was very faithful. They would go and they would worship at the temple that was set up in the city of Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant was there. And year after year they would go. Hannah then she prayed earnestly that the Lord would give her a son. And she promised the Lord that if he gave her a son, she would not make the redemption sacrifices required for the firstborn, meaning that her firstborn son, would then serve the Lord all the days of his life, belong to the Lord. And so she becomes pregnant, gives birth, she weans the little boy, and then takes him, and he begins to serve in the temple under the priest Eli. And that's where we pick up here in 1 Samuel chapter 3. It says, "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision." Now, the Hebrew word here for boy means young man. It's the same word used for David in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 33, when he fought Goliath. So it's a very good chance at this point, Samuel has been serving in the temple for 10 years or so. He's ministering to the Lord under the influence of Eli. But Samuel is of such steadfastness that he does not allow Eli's influence, which is somewhat negative, as we will see. He doesn't allow Eli's influence to pull him away from the Lord. And it says here, the word of the Lord was rare. That doesn't mean that the Lord never spoke, just that he did not have very many people who were interested to hear what he had to say. And Samuel was ministering. So it seems as though he's taken quickly and taken well to the task that he had before him. It could very well be the case that he had been raised under his mother's care with the knowledge that he would be serving in the temple. And then that understanding informed his worship at the end of chapter 1 and the description of him here, his service here in chapter 3. What is interesting is that verse 7 tells us that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. And yet here in verse 1, he's found to be diligently serving the Lord anyway. He had not yet had his own personal experience or developed his own personal relationship with the Lord. All that he knew of the Lord, he had been told of by others, by his parents, by Eli. And yet Samuel simply did serve the Lord. He had heard what others said about the Lord, about God's heart, about his work. And that for him was more than enough to worship and serve. You know, really, how convicting for us today who sometimes feel as though we need to have a certain feeling or be in a certain mood in order to worship and serve. And here is this young boy who finds the reports of the Lord's work all that he needs in order to devote his life in service to the Lord. Verse 2. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. So Eli, he's quite advanced in age. He had been serving as a priest and judge for the nation for over 4 decades. And we have this description here of his physical struggle, lack of eyesight. But as we will see, the author of 1 Samuel here uses a physical description to also describe a spiritual condition. So Eli, just as his eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, so also had his spiritual eyesight begun to grow dim. Verse 1 told us that no one listened to the Lord or saw a vision from the Lord very often. And Eli, at least as the judge, definitely as the priest, should have been paying enough attention to hear the Lord's voice. And we know from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 17, that Eli knew about the Lord and he knew how to properly respond, even if he did not respond well at first, just as he will again not respond well at first later on in this chapter. Maybe Eli took up the role as priest because of his lineage. Maybe he was genuinely called by God 40 years earlier, and something had happened over time that weakened his spiritual fervor. However it came to be, when we encounter Eli here at the beginning of 1 Samuel, he is not in the best of spiritual conditions himself. His spiritual sight had begun to dim to the point that he had difficulty being able to see what the Lord wanted, and had difficulty hearing what the Lord was saying to him for the instruction of the people. He almost seemed to be going through the motions of keeping up the traditions and the temple because he did not know what else to do, because his own spirituality prevented him from hearing the Lord. And the reality was that with the training of Samuel, Eli was training his own replacement, who would ultimately far outpace him in faithfulness. Look at verse 3. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Back in Exodus chapter 27, verse 21, the Lord had said that there was supposed to be a lamp outside the veil in the temple that was to be kept burning all night long. And so this gives us a time frame for that particular time of day. The phrasing is that the lamp had not yet gone out, implying that dawn was close at hand. In addition, Eli had just been described as lacking sight, and here is Samuel near to the lamp of God among the darkness of Shiloh. So while Eli was in the dark, Samuel had his way lightened by the lamp of God. Some have suggested that possibly Samuel is lying near the Ark of the Covenant in an effort to receive a message from the Lord. There was an ancient Near East practice called incubation, wherein an individual would spend the night in a holy place, hoping to receive a message from the deity for whom the holy place had been built, though when the Lord does speak to Samuel, he seems surprised to have heard a voice. He actually assumes that the voice came from the only other person that he knows is nearby, and possibly the only other person in the temple, Eli. He seems completely unaware of the possibility of the Lord speaking to him. In addition, it's really hard to imagine someone like Samuel, who is described so often in exemplary, faithful terms, to partake in a practice mimicking pagan worship such as incubating in a holy place. Rather, it seems much more likely that Samuel, of whom it has just been written in verse 1 that he is ministering in the temple, is lying in the temple because he is simply on duty. There may have been several tasks to which he would need to pay attention overnight so that those tasks were not neglected and they were ready for the next day of work. Look at verse 4. Then the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. You see, the Lord calls out to Samuel here, and Samuel responds with significant willingness, even though he was initially unaware to what exactly he was volunteering. And in truth, Samuel was not aware to whom exactly he was volunteering. He assumed that Eli was calling to him for some task, but it was the Lord who was speaking to him as he lay near the lamp of God. Notice also the enthusiasm of Samuel. He got up and he ran to where Eli was spending the night. He was eager to serve the Lord so much that he ran, thinking that Eli had another thing for him to do for the Lord. Again, how convicting for us to observe Samuel's passion for serving the Lord, that he will jump at the opportunity to do anything and everything at any time of day or night. And do we tend to exhibit the same level of devotion when we have the opportunity to do something for the Lord at what we might consider to be an inopportune moment? What might we say? Yeah, but he was serving in the temple. That was his job. I don't have the same kind of time to be doing as much as Samuel. Well, really, the issue isn't one of career choice, but rather it's one of dedication to the work of the Lord, wherever it may be, whether in the temple or in a cubicle, in an office, weeding a garden, or even stocking a shelf. The Lord's work isn't reserved only for the temple. The work of the Lord is done by every one of his followers wherever he has assigned them. And here Samuel comes running, thinking that Eli has called him, even though he has not. And to demonstrate his lack of spiritual sight, Eli does not recognize the Lord's intervention and simply tells Samuel, go back to his post in the temple. Look at verse 6. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Samuel's incredibly respectful and self-disciplined to return time and again without hesitation or apparent irritation. Up, down, in the middle of the night, Samuel goes into Eli again with them, with the same seeming level of expectation. Having already been rebuffed once, I personally might have been a little more resistant to the thought of going in to wake Eli up again. I might have been having an internal argument with myself about whether or not it was worth to go back and possibly wake him up again. But for Samuel, his dedication to serving the Lord, no matter what, it mattered more to him than any fear or any worry about the possibility of waking Eli again. All that he cared about was serving to the best of his ability, even though, as we've already been told, he did not yet know the Lord here. As we saw earlier, he was serving with such focused faithfulness based entirely on the testimony of other people instead of his own personal experience. He demonstrates a faithfulness that is foreign specifically during that time in history, but that is still quite rare today. This is very telling about Samuel, but it's also very important for the Lord to show that even during such incredibly faithless times, there were still faithful people. People throughout history have still shown faithfulness against a great faithless backdrop. People such as Noah, Moses, Ruth, Naomi, Boaz, Hannah, Elimelech, and here Samuel. People always have the choice about whether or not to conform to the faithlessness of the culture around them or not. And Samuel chose faithfulness. Verse 8. And the Lord called Samuel again a third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. 3 times the Lord called to Samuel. And 3 times Samuel goes to Eli to seeking an answer to that call. Eli is slow on the uptake because of his own spiritual blindness. But on the 3rd time, Eli recognizes the possibility. Eli had not himself heard from the Lord, possibly in a very long time. And now the Lord was not calling to Eli, but instead the Lord was calling to this boy. There is still knowledge of the Lord in Eli and knowledge of how to respond to the Lord. Once he knew why Hannah was crying and mouthing in chapter 1, he knew what to do. And here, once he finally realizes that the Lord is speaking to Samuel, he tells him the proper way to respond. And to Eli's credit, there doesn't seem to be any recognizable jealousy that the Lord is speaking to the boy rather than to him. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that the Lord would speak to someone so young rather than to someone like himself who has age and maturity on his side. Eli seems very willing to believe that the Lord could and would speak to someone like Samuel. There isn't any resistance to the idea at all. Again, very personally convicting for us. Are we ever resistant to the speaking of the Lord to someone else instead of speaking to us? Have we ever been doubtful of a young person's experience with the Lord simply because of that person's age? Eli here finally understands what is happening, and he sends Samuel back to his place near the lamp of God, near the ark. Verse 10. And the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant hears. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. Samuel is called a 4th time. And this time the Lord comes and stands next to Samuel. This is very interesting, considering that God is spirit, as Jesus says in John 4:24, a spirit does not have the capability to stand. Now, God is able to do whatever he wants with the laws of corporeal versus incorporeal because he created all things. However, many scholars believe that any apparent physical manifestation of God is in reality the only known physical manifestation of God, meaning Jesus. This is also believed to be the case with the appearance of the fourth man in the fiery furnace in Daniel chapter 3. And if this is the case, then here Jesus came and stood and called to Samuel physically a fourth time. In theological terms, this would be what is called a Christophany. That's a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. And Samuel responds to his call with exact obedience to the instruction from Eli. And then the Lord begins to give Samuel a message that will both actively impact Eli's family and passively impact the entire nation as a whole. And then this interesting phrase, tingling ears. That seems to be a common expression referring to a great coming judgment because it's used in the same type of way in 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 12 and Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 3. Tingling ears for people who hear of a coming judgment. Look at verse 12. On that day, this is again the Lord speaking to Samuel. On that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 2, Eli's sons are said to not even know the Lord. So similar to Samuel, but stark contrast. Samuel was serving the Lord faithfully even though he didn't know the Lord. Here, Eli's sons do not know the Lord, and yet they are still serving as priests, possibly serving as priests simply by lineage instead of calling, instead of personal relationship. So we have these unbelieving priests of the Lord, and they're acting as unbelieving priests during the time of the judges would be presumed to act. They stole from the Lord's offerings for themselves. 1 Samuel 2:17 says they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. In addition, they would commit adultery with the women who came to the temple to serve the Lord, being married themselves. Eli told his sons that they ought not to be doing these things. So he confronted them. But Eli did not stop them, nor did Eli remove them from their place as priests. Eli allowed them to continue to serve as priests and leaders in the nation without any repercussions. And so in chapter 2, a prophet of God comes to Eli and tells him that his lineage will be cut off, and they will eventually be cut off during the time of David. But in the immediate present, both Eli and the sons will be cut off. And God holds Eli responsible because he knows of the evil that his sons are doing, but he does not do anything to stop them. Now, yes, he does tell them they are doing bad things, but he doesn't do more than just talk to them. So the Lord tells Samuel that all of this is about to start taking place. And now Samuel has this knowledge that his influence, his mentor Eli, is going to be suffering great loss in the coming days. So look at verse 15. Samuel lay until morning, then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, here I am. Now, Samuel didn't go back to Eli after hearing the message from the Lord. He just lay back down and waited until it was time to get up. If you were Eli and you had sent Samuel back to lay down to hear a message from the Lord, knowing that the Lord had already called him 3 times, wouldn't you stay awake hoping to hear a report about what the message was? I know that if I were Eli, I would be waiting for a report only to be left awake without any news until morning. Samuel didn't return to Eli after receiving the news because he was afraid to tell him such a report that would be such bad news for his family. But Eli would not allow himself to be avoided. Eli called out to Samuel. He wanted to hear what had happened. He wanted to know if the Lord had called for a fourth time and what he had said. But Samuel was afraid to return to Eli. But he was too honorable to ignore him, too honorable to hide from him. So when Eli called to him for real this time, Samuel responded, and they came together for this conversation that Samuel had been hesitant to have. Notice Samuel's assent here to come and share what he had heard. It follows Eli's reference to Samuel as a son. Samuel was now being raised by Eli. His family would come to visit, naturally. They would come at least once a year for the sacrifice and feast. But Eli and Samuel would naturally have developed a father-son relationship in the course of their regular daily joint service to the Lord. And so Samuel goes in and begins to share with Eli. Verse 17. And Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." So Eli makes a solemn oath, similar to what the Lord said to Ezekiel in Ezekiel 3:17-21, that if he refused to speak a prophetic warning, then the consequences would be laid on him. There are still times that it seems as though Eli remembers what to do and how to act as a priest and a judge of the Lord. Eli is insistent on knowing exactly what the Lord had said to Samuel, and apparently he had discerned that Samuel was resistant to share everything. Maybe Samuel regularly was quick to open the doors and was quick to come see Eli first thing in the morning, but today had been different. Maybe there was something about Samuel's demeanor that day that made Eli realize that Samuel seemed to be withholding something. For whatever reason, Eli figured out that Samuel was holding back and needed to be urged to reveal everything. So then Samuel told Eli everything that the Lord had said to him during the night. Undoubtedly, it wasn't easy for Samuel to reveal all of this news. It would not have been a surprise to Eli, as another prophet had told him this back in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And again, to his credit, Eli accepts the word of the Lord without resistance, without complaining. Rather, he trusts the Lord to accept anything from his hand, even if it means something difficult, even if it means death. Eli seemed to know what was right. He seemed to know what the Lord wanted. But he did not seem to be able to actually do anything to correct the destructive actions of his own sons. Look here at the end, verse 19. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So Samuel's words were the Lord's words, because the Lord was with him. Samuel did not say things with any amount of idleness because he listened to the Lord's words, his ever-present voice. The Lord's influence is what sustained the consistency of Samuel's words. It had nothing to do with Samuel as the one speaking them, but rather it had everything to do with the words coming from the Lord to begin with. And he says here, everybody in Israel knew this, all the way from Dan down to Beersheba. Dan is the northernmost Israelite town, and Beersheba is the southernmost Israelite town. So everybody in Israel knew that the Lord had chosen Samuel and confirmed him as the national prophet for the first time in a very long time, possibly the first time since Moses. This word to Samuel from the Lord continued to come to Samuel at Shiloh. Presumably, it was communicated in this way because the temple was at Shiloh. But that is not to say that the Lord did not speak to Samuel in other places, because we see the Lord do just that when Saul is anointed and when David is anointed, for instance. The revealing of the word of the Lord is not limited to circumstances or location. The Lord can be heard by anyone willing to listen, no matter where they happen to be. We just need to listen. So thank you for joining us today and checking out 1 Samuel chapter 3. Come back next time and we will be looking further into what happens next in the book of 1 Samuel.